Hello and welcome back. So, now we're going to talk about service delivery teams within the school system. This is a pretty quick one. This shouldn't take us much more than 10 or 15 minutes. So, you'll enjoy that, I'm sure. In a nutshell, here you go. Intervention is based on behaviors, performance, occupations, and context. Okay, so we need to be thinking about the behaviors of the child, how the child performs in different areas, what occupations are they successful at, and what is the context that they're working in. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough because we're one of the few disciplines that looks at the context of the individual, right? So when we evaluate, and you'll be doing much of that next semester, we'll be looking at how does whatever impairment that they have influence their ability to perform. All right. So, and what in the environment can we take to support that child? How can we change the environment? Or what is in the environment that is interfering? And I think I talked about one of the times that I had a student with CP who was not ambulatory, and he was moving to a new school, and the school did not have an elevator, so they decided to put his classroom on the first floor. And then they thought about it, and we found out, well, that's great for his classroom to be on the first floor, but then on the third floor was where the cafeteria was. It was a very old setting. So they had to do quite a bit of environmental changes, and they weren't real happy about the fact that they had to do things like put in an elevator for the child. So you always have to be thinking about what is in the environment and how does it help support the child in that environment. And then we look at any discrepancies between the performance and what constraints this environment might have on the child. Some of the things that we think about when we're thinking about OT practice with children is, again, we've talked about this all semester, that it's child-centered. We take a strengths-based approach, which is a bit different than the medical model. And we also look at the family, because the family is also the client. We always try to perform services in the natural environment. So in early intervention, that might be the child's home, and in the schools, it would be within the student's classroom. So there's a real push, pardon the term, I guess but there's a real push to have the child be seen within the classroom rather than the pull-out model. So anytime, and that is the law, you can see it here in my notes. I've left my notes here for you so that you can see them. It is the law. So if you can possibly complete your intervention within the classroom setting, then that's where you should be. Okay? So remember, the child is a person first. They're not a person, they're not somebody who has CP or somebody with Duchenne, MD. They're a person first. So you really need to look at what are the concerns and the priorities of the child and the family. What is it they need and want to do that they are unable to do, right? It's also important, obviously, to find out what the family's interests are and what their preferences are, because this is really going to tell you what you're going to do for intervention, right? If your intervention, I don't know, is, a cognitive intervention, and you're going to decide that, you have a fifth grader and you're going to play checkers. Well, if the family's interest is not in playing checkers, but maybe, they play another board game, then you want to find out what that is and involve and have that in your intervention. So always, 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 whenever the child can make a choice, and that can be pretty young. If you have a child who will say, is 4 or 5 years old, and you're saying, well, they don't talk, how can they really tell me what they want? Well, they can tell you, right? We talked about communication and how communication can happen in other ways and not just words, right? So you may have, 5 or 6 different types of toys that are going to give you the same end product. I want to work on, we'll say, grasping. And so you might have 5 or 6 different toys that will help you to get to that goal, help the child get to that goal of obtaining whatever grasp patterns they need to in order to be functional. But you have a choice of 5 different toys, so you put a few out. Put 2 or 3 different toys out and see which ones they go to. And always respect the child's emotions. One of the things that is very frustrating, I think, sometimes in working in pediatrics is that there are days that you just can't get done what you want to get done. You can have this nice plan of what your intervention is going to be, but if you go into, we'll say, a preschool setting and there's a 3-year-old and they're playing with their friends and they don't want to leave their friends to come and work with you, then you do it where you are. Why are you going to fight and argue with a 3-year-old? It's not worth it, trust me. So respect their emotions. If they're happy and engaged, fine, that's one thing. But if they're angry about something, you work through that first with them. Okay? And, we talk about, again, all semester we've been talking about family-centered practice. And the best way to have family-centered practice is to develop a rapport with the child and the family. So you need to have open communication, which is very difficult, I can tell you, from experience in the school setting, but it is possible. Writing a little note, we'll say in a book, having a book about services that child received that day that goes back and forth to the family, or making a phone call, making it a point of calling, a handful of parents every week. And by the time you get to the end of your month or maybe 2 months, you've called and spoke to at least, all of them at least once. And building respect, you will build trust if you respect the parents, wherever they're coming from, and be positive about their child, letting them know, part of the reason why we did the developmental chart in this class is because it's very important for you to know what are the next steps for the child. So letting them know that, your child can do whatever, X, Y, and Z now, and these are the things, that will be coming after. And getting to know them and what their preferences are. And remembering that, again, it's the family, it's the child, and you really need to know and understand them. And the only way to know and understand them is to ask questions. Okay, so don't be afraid to ask questions, and hopefully you make sure that they're open-ended questions, so we're not getting a lot of yes and no's from parents. What do they want and appreciate? Well, they want you to be very specific about their child and what sorts of strengths that they have and skills that they have and what skills are coming next. They want you to be flexible. They want you to be on call pretty much 24/7. They want you to be the expert. I've talked about this in class again often. Just the tone of your voice and the way you answer a question. Are you answering questions with a question? Or are you saying, this is what I believe, or gee, I am not sure, but I will get back to you. Parents respect that, as long as you're not saying it every time you speak to them. So be sensitive to them, be responsive to whatever their concerns are, and just let them know that you are confident in what you're doing. You can leave later after that, whatever meeting with a parent, and say, oh my goodness, I have no idea. That's okay. Okay. But when you're in the presence of a family and a parent or caregiver, you need to act like the expert. Gee, I'm not quite sure. I know a great deal about that topic, but you know what? I want to think about that a little bit and think about your child and where their skills are, and I'll get back to you. And then get back to them, because you will earn their respect eventually. And one of the things I have to say is that if you say you're going to follow up with a parent, absolutely always follow up. So the strengths-based approach I mentioned earlier, it's different than the medical approach. It's more holistic. We look at the strengths of the child and we start there. So we look at something that the child can do and is able to do and enjoys doing, and then we build upon that. Okay, very different from the medical model where you might look at, what is the disability? Oh, we have a, decreased range of motion, so we're going to work on increasing that range of motion. No, we look at what can the child do, and then what next steps can we take them to. And if you can think about this and change your mindset a little bit and look at strengths rather than remediating from a disability, it's really going to help motivate the child and the parents to work on next steps. So the other thing that we think about is we think about service delivery in the area, especially of schools. You have direct service delivery, so where you might be meeting one-on-one with that child. And you might be in a pull-out model where you take them to a therapy room, or indirect, where you might do some consultation and go in and maybe adapt or modify the environment a little bit. For example, you may, if they want the child, will say the child doesn't have good wrist extension, and this is something that you want to promote, and they're having difficulty with holding a writing implement because of this. So you might just change where the child's writing. Maybe they stand up and we tape the paper to the wall to promote that wrist extension. Monitoring is not done as often as in the past. Some school systems will not do monitoring at all. It's an either-or approach where you either consult or you have the child on direct services, but you're not monitoring. And it's kind of sad because monitoring does help. There are students that I used to monitor maybe 4 times a year, just go in and touch base with them and see and make sure that they're continuing to progress, because I evaluated and they may have been delayed but not significantly, and wanted just to make sure that the development was on track and they were able to do and engage in those activities that they wanted to. The coaching model, Kay Smith does a fairly nice job in Chapter 3 on the coaching model. It talks about things like emotional support. So supporting will say the teacher or the parent, give them some information on the things that you would like their child, to see what their child can do. And then you have some sort of structured process where you set goals and set up some interventions, and then set up a time maybe to go over and review if those interventions have been successful, easy for me to say. And then you educate them about all sorts of things, the accessibility in the environment. I remember a classroom teacher who was the first year she was going to have a student who was confined to a wheelchair, and she was very concerned about this and liked her classroom, in such a way. I went in, I talked to her about, different ways of changing up her classroom, maybe not having desks so close to the door so that the child had lots of space to move around, and make sure that they're accessible. If they had she had a reading corner, I remember, and it was in the corner of her room, and it also had several seats like bean bags, etc., whatever. And so we just reorganized it a little bit so that the child could get in and access the entire room from his wheelchair. And you find that, especially in the school setting, you're a very strong advocate. I think that this has decreased over the years because more and more students, it's been now, excuse me, since 1975 that students with any sort of handicapping disability have been included in the classroom. So 75, 85, 95, 2005, 2015, it's been 40 some odd years, right? So many of the teachers that might have been, quite honestly, might have been a little resistant to this, may already have been retired by now. And then you have a mix of all, right? We could be doing direct and indirect service at the same time. We could be doing direct service, 1 times 30 minutes a week for a child in the classroom setting, and then maybe we consult with the classroom teacher once a month just to see how things are going and the adaptations and how are they working. Direct service in early intervention. In early intervention, OT is a primary service, okay, so Part C of IDEA. And what that means is that OT can be the sole provider of the service. They can also be the coordinator of the service. It is not, in most settings, this is not true for the occupational therapist, okay? In early intervention, usually you work in teams, and usually the person, whatever areas are of most concern is usually the area that the child that the is usually the area that will be like the lead provider of service. So if self-feeding was the primary concern and a goal for the child, you might have an occupational therapist, you might have a behavioralist, and you might have a speech therapist, we'll say, all working with that child. But maybe the occupational therapist is the lead person because they're the person that has the most knowledge about self-feeding and the concerns and difficulties of the child. School-based services, you're a related service, which means that you can, there needs to be another service in order for occupational therapy to be on the service grid. So the child needs to be receiving an individualized education plan. So they must need some sort of adjustment to their educational plan in order for occupational therapy to be involved. And again, I noted already that you can have push-in services, inclusion, or you can be Part C of the grid, the IEP grid, which I know you went over with Dr. Zobel. You could have pull-out services outside of the classroom. Okay. One of the most important things that you have to think about, though, is that even students that do not attend school can still receive their related services. Sometimes you'll have students that are medically fragile, and maybe the school system doesn't have a program for that, or maybe the parents just have decided that they want to homeschool. So the child doesn't end up in school, as I noted here, is that the child doesn't end up in school to receive related services. They receive services so that they can attend and participate in school. And it's a little bit of different thinking there. Again, I noted it in pull-out. It's typically performed in some sort of, you may have a space, you may not. You may be in a hallway. It can be individual or small group. But whatever you do and whatever your goals are, you're here and working in the schools as an occupational therapist to support the academic needs of the child, okay? Inclusion, when we talk about inclusion in integrated services, we want the child to be able to be functional within the community, so the community of the school. So oftentimes, I can tell you that when I did inclusion services, oftentimes I would work with the child, especially here in the cafeteria. It's a wonderful place to be working with a child, whether it's because they have sensory issues because of all the noises and the smells and the movement going on in there. Or it's in a classroom setting, a small classroom setting, as we see here. What we have to do, though, and what the law says, is that we have to be in the natural setting as much as possible. So in early intervention, you may be working in the home, but, years ago, 20 years ago, you would walk into that home and you would be carrying a big bag of your toys, and then you would leave with your big bag of toys. So now what early intervention, the focus has been in the past, I'd say at least 10 years, is that you use whatever toys are there in the child's home in their natural setting. And that will help you to meet the least restrictive environment. Implementing inclusion, it can be really difficult. Physical preference here, I noted that it does not mean that it's inclusion. Just because the child is in the classroom setting doesn't mean they're fully included. It means that they're involved in what is going on, whatever the activity is. It doesn't mean that every child will learn the same things, but it does mean that they will participate within the classroom with their peers to the fullest extent that they can. Oh, I thought this was going to be shorter, but here we are, 20 minutes. OT inclusion services provided least restrictive environment. Yes, yes, yes. So we talked about it. So I want to just go here. Again, here are all of the different places that you can be of help. Especially, I love this picture here. This child is clearly in phys ed class and is being fully included, and he looks like he's playing a game of kickball. Cafeteria was another place that I often would do treatment, and also the playground, because the playground is one of those places that it can be very overwhelming for many children because of everybody else running around and doing whatever, right? But it's a great place for full inclusion because we can modify and change things up just a little bit, or give the child a little assistance. Maybe when trying to walk up, we'll say, the stairs here, maybe the child needs another smaller step, we'll say, just to get in, and then they can be fairly functional. Or maybe the child has a friend that can motivate them to climb higher, faster, longer. Integrated fluid service delivery models, and we're at the end here. So co-teaching is the one thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit here. And Kay Smith, again, discusses co-teaching and talks about, in co-teaching, there are several different models. You can have one teacher teaching and one assisting. You can set up stations in the classroom, and maybe you're a part of that station. So the children move and the adults stay at a specific station. You can work parallel to each other, where you're maybe doing the same, giving the same sorts of instructions, but maybe one person is modifying them a little bit. You can have small groups. You can have team teaching, where teachers will share the lead. So lots of different opportunities. And thing that I wanted to note for you is that this can occur, especially when you find a classroom where you have maybe several children at risk for being delayed in their development. Instead of maybe having separate RTI groups, you might actually go in and co-teach in a specific classroom, maybe once a week or once every other week, just so that you can keep an eye on those children without having to pull them out of their schedules. Here I didn't mention at all block scheduling. So block scheduling, you have your block, you go in, you see the child, you might spend 2 or 3 hours in that classroom. And lead groups, or just simply support, like a co-teaching model in that classroom. But it's typically you're there for 2 or 3 hours. And this really works well when you have several students in the classroom, maybe that are on individual IEPs, individualized education plans. So, for instance, we do still have special education classrooms where the majority of the children are in there most likely because of behavioral problems. So maybe once a week you spend a few hours in that classroom and you're meeting the needs of 4 or 5 different students at the same time. Okay, so resources, I added here AOTA statement of school-based OT and the role of OT in youth in school-based practice. They're from AOTA. And that finishes up schools, I think. There's enough to say about schools, isn't there? Next week is our last week, Foundations of Practice, and we'll be talking about some models that we use. And stay well, and hopefully we'll all see each other soon.